Hello, and welcome to this conversation at the Natural History Museum. I'm Khalil Thirlaway. We're in an environmental emergency right now, and it's more important than ever that we understand and improve our relationship with nature before it's too late. To help spread that understanding, environmental activist and campaigner for climate and social justice, Greta Thunberg, has been putting together the Climate Book, a collection of short pieces by leading scientists exploring various aspects of our relationship with nature, and framed with her own writing as well. One of the scientists who's contributed to the Climate Book is biodiversity researcher at the Natural History Museum, Adriana De Palma. Today, we're going to have a conversation about an issue that often gets sidelined in conversations about the environment, and that's the importance of biodiversity to the viability of our world, and the threats to it, and what we can do to fight to protect it. So, to start us off, Adriana, biodiversity is a term that gets bandied around quite a bit, but what is biodiversity and why is it important?
Biodiversity is the variety of life on Earth. So that's everything from orchids to elephants, but also including things like gene diversity in our wild crops, but also in our wild species. It's everything on the planet. And it's often overlooked how much we depend on biodiversity. Biodiversity doesn't just provide us with a really interesting and beautiful place to live, it also makes our planet livable for us. So it provides everything from clean air and water, food and fuel. It can even provide us with medicines and help us with our mental health.
And Greta, how would you describe the importance of biodiversity to our lives?
We have some kind of tendency when it comes to the climate crisis and similar issues that we separate them and talk about one thing, that this is the climate crisis. It's higher temperatures and more extreme weather events. And then this is biodiversity loss. When we need to talk about them together because they are intertwined, interlinked. We are depending on both of them. They are both are consequences of the same crisis, a larger sustainability crisis that has the same causes. They're rooted in the same mindset that we can exploit people and planet and continue living like there was no tomorrow.
And that kind of unsustainable relationship with nature and that extractive relationship has kind of brought us to where we are. So, Adriana, what does biodiversity actually do for us? You said it makes our planet livable, but how?
Well, as I said, so biodiversity is what provides us with food. So if you like your coffee in the morning or an apple in your afternoon break, all of those things are provided for you because we have pollinator species that are helping to support those crops. When we think about, climate management as well, this is, a natural thing that has been happening because of biodiversity. So think about an earthworm, because they burrow so deep into the ground, that actually helps with water drainage and so protects us against flood risk in a lot of cases. But also, going outside in biodiversity in nature can support your mental health and your emotional well-being as well. So there's, benefits that we can quantify, like crops. We can get more crops because of biodiversity. They're higher quality crops because of biodiversity. Those are things that are kind of obvious. They're goods that we get from biodiversity. And then there's a side of things that is harder to quantify. So the fact that it is beautiful and beauty around us is important for us. It's a cultural asset, but also a mental health asset. Those things are a little bit harder to quantify, but still all really important for us to have a healthy and happy life on this planet.
And it's important to note that, when we talk about biodiversity, it's not just the variety of things, but the connections between all those living things as well, and they support each other. So each one that gets taken away weakens the support for all the others around it. And Greta, you mentioned that it's closely tied to the climate crisis as well. Could you expand on that a little bit, please?
I think it's a kind of strange to like say like this is what biodiversity does for us. These are the services that it provides. Of course, that's a very important aspect of it. But we forget that humans are also part of biodiversity. We are also like a part of nature. So when we talk about biodiversity, we are not only talking about beetles and flowers, but we are also talking about humans, and every single species on Earth, and yeah, the connection, and like. Biodiversity and the climate crisis, and many other similar topics as well, are things that individually are terrifying enough and would be devastating enough, but now they are all happening at the same time, amplifying each other. Biodiversity loss, like climate change, the climate crisis leads to biodiversity loss, but also biodiversity loss makes the Earth and the biosphere ecosystems much less resilient to the effects of the climate crisis. So it's like a very negative cycle. For example, in Sweden, where I live, we have lots of monocultural like tree plantations, which the forest industry likes to call forests, but mostly tree plantations. And that makes them, when it's only like one species and not a healthy ecosystem, it makes them much more vulnerable to, for example, wildfires that also are coming more frequent and extreme because of increased droughts, increased temperature, and so on. So they amplify each other. And then the carbon that is being released from those forest fires also, in turn, makes the climate crisis worse. So it's a very negative cycle.
Yeah, and the fact that these problems are so linked makes them really hard to kind of have a simple solution to. And Adriana, Greta mentioned monoculture, these kind of one species kind of tree plantations. What is the difference between that and a more varied forest in terms of its kind of value to biodiversity?
A natural system, you don't see a single species dominating. That's not really how the world works. Everything survives in balance. It's developed over millions of years so that all species are kind of surviving in balance. And yes, there's competition that happens, and some species will fail because another one is more dominant. But it's a balanced kind of flow. It's a balanced change. And when you have that balance, you've got a system that's relatively stable. It's not suffering from soil erosion because it's got a diversity of tree species that are supporting the soil at different depths, are pulling up water at different depths. It's got different bird species in there that are spreading seeds from different tree species. So that balance of species maintains a stable, healthy ecosystem that's more resilient to, as Greta said, things like wildfires. So if you think about the wildfires in Portugal that have been growing steadily worse, a lot of that is because the native natural forests that are really resistant to fires have been exchanged for eucalyptus plantations, which are really important for bringing in money for the local economy, but they're essentially tinder. So as soon as there's a small spark, they all go up in flame, and they haven't got that natural resistant built in anymore.
So, Greta, how bad is the current state of the biodiversity crisis? What's the current trajectory?
To summarize, it's really bad. I think
Yep.
I think you have more mandate to speak about that than I do, though.
Adriana?
How bad is the climate and biodiversity crisis?
Yes. Other than just bad.
I mean, I'm going to say it in a different way, which is we're in a planetary emergency. It is bad. We are in a state of crisis, both in terms of biodiversity and climate change. So our environment is suffering because we're pushing it to the brink. We push and push and push. And we don't really know where that cliff edge is. We just know that we're heading towards it at a dangerous pace.
And what is that cliff edge?
Well, essentially, when we drop off that cliff, we haven't got a livable planet anymore. So eventually, as you lose biodiversity, when you lose enough of it, it will no longer provide us with crops. It's no longer going to be able to clean the air quickly enough to remove all the pollution that we're pumping into it. Our water supplies will struggle to self-regulate and clean. So when we go off that cliff, I mean, the planet will be fine. It's just that it will be not livable for us anymore, and not livable for many of the species that survive with us now.
Yeah, an image that is often used to describe the kind of the livable ecosystem is like a Jenga tower or a house made of bricks. You can take out a certain number of bricks and it will kind of still stand up, but you take out one too many and the entire thing falls down.
Yeah.
I mean, another analogy is that musical chairs. Basically, you've taken out the chairs, but the music hasn't stopped. So we don't actually know how close we are to that cliff.
Yeah. There are, like, as you say, these are like tipping points and negative feedback loops that once we pass them, there might be no going back. And because the planet loses its abilities to like sustain life on Earth as we know it, and as you say, the planet will be fine because it's just the current ecosystems that will suffer, including us, because our life supporting systems are what is losing its ability to maintain us, and of course that comes into social justice because it's the ones that are already living on the front lines in the most vulnerable positions that will suffer the most. The climate is not just changing; it is breaking down the whole natural world as we know it is destabilizing, and some of us living in like financially fortunate parts of the world might initially be able to adapt to a rapidly warming world, but not for long. And that's also where this aspect of inequality comes in.
Yeah. So where does the understanding of this kind of cliff edge start to kind of influence our policy? Because to really fix the system and to fix our relationship with nature, we need to understand the problem and the causes of it and our ways out. So Adriana, you mentioned that we don't really know, we don't really fully understand the cliff edge. How much do we know and how are we finding out?
So there are lots and lots of different ways to measure biodiversity. But one of the ways is a measure that we've been developing at the Natural History Museum, and it has been suggested that if we fall below 90% of naturally occurring species abundance, so below 90% of nature's health, I suppose you can say, then we start to really risk no longer being able to pull out the services and benefits that we need from nature. So below 90%, and our systems are so degraded that they're not going to support us in the way that we need and we're used to. And if we think about 90%, the world as a whole, we're already at about 75%. So we're way below that boundary already.
And that's the kind of the human-centered kind of view, to be like, this is what we need to sustain ourselves.
Absolutely.
What about kind of the sustainability of kind of ecosystems more generally?
It's kind of one and the same. So a healthy ecosystem more generally is one that's going to provide us with the goods that we need. So it really is about learning to live in balance with nature. It's incredibly short-sighted as humans to degrade nature to pull more and more out of it, because eventually it won't provide us with those things anymore. So I think, thinking about nature in terms of benefits to humans is really just a way to explain to people how important it is, but it's much greater than that. But even if we're thinking more broadly, you've got 1 million species threatened with extinction right now. I mean, that's a phenomenal number of species. We're losing species before we've ever even had a chance to see and record them. So we're losing part of the richness and the beauty of our planet without even, we blink and it's gone.
When it comes to the climate, that a safety limit that is often being referred to is that we should not exceed 350 ppm, like CO2 in the atmosphere.
That's parts per million, right?
Yeah, parts per million. And we exceeded that in 1987. so like but like that just shows like how far off we are, and we are still talking about that we will reach net zero by 2050, and then we will try to compensate for our emissions, when we in fact need to compensate for the damage that has already been done, the damage that is happening right now. Yeah.
Because if we're setting these targets
Yeah.
and just breezing straight past them,
Yeah.
what does that mean?
It means a lot of things. It means that, I mean, I would say that it means that our main goal right now is not to halt the climate and biodiversity crisis. Our main target right now is to trying to find solutions within this system that will allow us to maintain our current ways of living, our current economics and political structures, without having to change anything. And as long as we are not looking for real solutions to the climate and environmental crisis, we are not going to find anything.
And I think we're going to come on to real solutions in a sec. But Adriana, I think we do have some images of kind of deforestation happening. So can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Sure. So, I mean, I'm sure many of you have seen things like this before. So from satellite imagery, we can see our impact on the planet, and it is devastating. I mean, we're still losing about 10 million hectares a year in forest, and I'm not very good at understanding what those sorts of sizes mean. So if my searching is correct, that's equivalent to about the size of Iceland. So we're losing Iceland in forest every year at the moment, and that's actually much better than it was, which is a scary, scary thought. But what we can't see from images like this is the consequences of that deforestation.
So I think we've got some images as well that show. So what are we looking at here?
So this is Borneo in the year 2001, and this is that index of, it's a measure of nature's health.
So the darker colours are healthier.
Exactly.
And as you go towards the brighter colours, you've lost more and more of that biodiversity, more and more of the resilience of those ecosystems.
Yeah. So unless you're in the super dark area, you're below that kind of safe boundary of 90%. And already you can see that by 2001, we've started encroaching into the natural forests in Borneo and degrading nature.
And then we have a later image,
which is 2012. So that's not that long after, and already you can see how much more damage we've been doing in such a short period of time by encroaching into that natural forest and converting it into things like agriculture.
And these are the monocultures that Greta was talking about.
Yeah, when we talk about forests, I mean, clear cuts and monocultural plantations are considered forests. So in Sweden, where I come from, we often say that we have more forest than ever. But like what we
It's
define
tree
as
cover.
Yeah.
So a lot of this space would, I guess, be palm oil plantations.
It's often, which can be very, very damaging. So when people think too narrowly about net zero, they often think, well, we can just plant loads of biofuel plantation, and that will suck in CO2 and reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. And to a certain extent, that is true. But if you've got these monoculture biofuel plantations, that's not as productive for our sustainability goals as protecting natural forests. If you remove a natural forest to plant biofuel plantations, that's one of the most damaging things that we can do for the environment. And long term, it's probably not that great for the climate crisis either.
And also, if you're talking about the beauty of nature, as you were before, a monocultural kind of forest is not going to be as full of life and variety as a natural mature forest. And you started talking earlier about kind of real solutions. So what are some of the large kind of system scale goals or solutions that we could work towards to help prevent further extinction, further loss of biodiversity?
These things that we're talking about are so big that people often get discouraged. Like, there's nothing I can do because there are two sides to it. Either we say that it's all up to the individual. We need to eat less meat, we need to use less plastic, and of course that might be good, but we lose the sense of we need like a fundamental system change. By the year 2030, the UN predicts that we will produce more than twice the amount of fossil fuels that would be consistent with the 1.5 degree target. And so if we are to stay below that target, that means we have to tear up and abandon valid deals and contracts. That's not possible within today's system. So objectively, this is science, the way of telling us that we need a system change. But then, of course, there are many things that we can do. We can't just sit back and say, well, we need a system change, so it doesn't matter what I do. Individual action and systemic action go hand in hand. And by individual action, I mean more like become activists, take it to the streets, and push for these systematic changes that we need. And of course, there are many things that we can do while we'll try to bring about that change. Like, for example, invest in science and technology, but also make changes that are, like, for example, expand renewable energy, divest from fossil fuels completely, and things like that.
But if those are the actions we need to take, what do you see as some of the barriers between us and actually taking those actions? Because we've been talking about the importance of those changes for quite a while, and we haven't seen a huge amount of kind of real meaningful action towards it at a kind of international level. I
mean, you can see it in many different ways. We could say that, well, we haven't got enough technology to solve this by itself. You could also see it as we have had lobbyists, politicians who have actively tried to prevent this from happening, think tanks, and people who have been trying to distract, delay, and deny what's happening, but also the changes that are needed. And of course, it's very hard to improve or turn things around when we are playing defense, when we are trying to. This is the fight for the natural world is limited to like a desperate struggle to avoid a complete disaster. We are fighting against those who are trying to destroy the world, instead of. I mean, imagine if we could spend that energy, give the platform to those who actually have solutions. For example, indigenous peoples, the ones that are mostly affected. Imagine what we could do then if we aren't spending all our time trying to fight greedy politicians and lobbyists
for survival.
Yeah.
Adriana, have you got something to add about that?
I'm not an economist, but I do agree with Greta that it's really easy to feel like at the moment people are just trying to change just enough so that we can stay with the status quo. We can keep going as we have been. But I think if we actually value the environment, then a lot of the changes will kind of come about naturally. So at the moment, if a company goes out and deforests natural land to expand agriculture, that comes with a really significant environmental cost. But at the moment, they're not paying it, even though that cost is just as real as the cost of labor or the cost of transporting your goods. It's not those people doing the damage most of the time that are paying the environmental cost. Instead, it's paid, potentially decades down the road, and often by the poorest and most vulnerable people in our communities. So instead, if we give the environment true value, we'll end up with a system potentially where the polluter is the one who pays, but also some of the poorest communities and the poorest countries will suddenly become much wealthier because they've got such a wealth of natural assets. They're contributing to our climate control. They're contributing to all of the benefits that we need from nature. So I think, actually valuing the environment means we'll see, fundamental changes in our food systems, and in, fossil fuel consumption and all of those environmentally degrading practices.
So, Greta, Adriana mentioned kind of changing our relationship with nature and making sure that we value it inherently at the start of things. And obviously spreading that message is something that you've been working very hard on. How do you find that? How do you kind of keep that power going?
Uh, I don't. I mean, we are many millions of climate activists all over the world, who and so many of us feel from time to time that we are not seeing any changes. Nothing is happening. We are still on the wrong path. We are still going the wrong direction, speeding in the wrong direction. Actually, picking up speed. So it's. I mean, it's hard, but you kind of have to remind yourself that we're in this for the long run. At least I never expected this to be something that would be easy, that would change quickly. We are already, I mean, people who have been pioneering the climate movement and the environmental movement have been doing so for decades. So that gives you some kind of perspective of where we are. And of course, it's different now, because now it's a full-on existential crisis. Much for every day that we wait, it gets worse, and it gets more urgent. But yeah, we're in this for the long run, and I don't know that. I think for many of us, the things that keeps us going is just the fact that we are doing what is right. For me, this gives me some kind of a sense of meaning and purpose, that I'm doing something that means something. And the climate movement is a global movement with many people, and we know that we have each other, and we're in this together.
And I think that's a really important point. You mentioned that the environmental movement is a massive movement, and it's all about kind of collaboration and collective action. So, what can young people do to get involved and to help drive this attitude change and system change that we need to protect our environment?
Of course, there's a way that works for everyone. Everyone can't participate in the global climate strikes. Everyone don't have the capacity to organize. Everyone is not privileged enough to spend all their free time doing activism. But I feel like those of us who can have some kind of moral obligation to do at least something. And of course that something is up to everyone, what they feel works best for them. We all have a role to play. This is an existential emergency, and some of us have a bigger responsibility and a bigger platform than others, and of course that means that they have to use that. But for some, taking action can just be to talk to the people around you, to talk to if you're young, talk to your parents, like go to a protest, email or call your local representative. Of course, that won't be enough for those who have the power to do more, but it's a way to start. For me, it started with I started to turn off the lights in my home to save energy, and then that led to one thing that led to another thing. We young people need to realize that, I mean, people talk about us all the time, that we are the future, we are the ones who are going to change things. When we are the ones in power, we can improve the state of the world. And yeah, that is probably true, but we don't really have time for that, because the time frame we have for the goals of the Paris Agreement, staying below 1.5 degree, if we want to do that, which really good if we could. That means that we have to change these following years, especially for high-income countries like the UK is high emitting historically.
And you mentioned that people talk about kind of this current generation of young people as, oh, they're going to be the saviors of our future when they're in power. But there are people who are in power now who don't seem to be doing a huge amount.
And that's why we need to force them into taking action. We need to show them that we will not let them get away with continuing like now, because they are doing so because they think that they can get away, and so far they haven't really been held accountable. But more and more people are starting to wake up and see the reality that we face.
Adriana, do you have something to add on that?
I think I just agree with all of that while young people do have a really important voice, really we need to push the people in power and, large companies to think more long-term about environmental sustainability and, convince them that actually, if you want to be economically sustainable in the long term, protecting the environment is a good way to do that. And, there are individual actions that people can take. I mean, when you've got a third of food wasted and 1 in 9 people being undernourished, just not wasting is a hugely important initial step. But I'm wary of putting too much pressure on young people, because already we're seeing, eco-anxiety levels rising in the population. So yes, there are definitely things you can do, but it's not all on you. So don't, take all of that burden onto your shoulders. But as from a scientific perspective, what I'd love is actually to hear from more young people about what questions they think are important. Because often, we, as scientists, we come up with questions we think are interesting and think are important, and then we do the science and we try and publicize that. But maybe we're not asking the right questions. And so, as young people living in this society in this age, it would be really valuable to hear their opinions.
Well, I think that's an excellent time to actually start asking some of these young people their opinions and questions, because we've talked about a long time about how a lot of pressure is put on individuals and the younger generation to make those changes, but actually we've realized that it is much more of a system change that's needed, and it's people power and it's individual action and collective action and community action that can help drive the demand for that. So at this point, be a good time to open up to any questions from our audience. I think we have a question up there.
Hello. Yeah, I think, like you mentioned earlier, a lot of people feel really anxious about the climate crisis. And I think it doesn't matter if you're young or old or whatever age you are and you want to get involved. Sometimes you can feel like you're not entitled or you don't know enough about environmentalism or about biodiversity to actually get involved. So I guess my question is, what tip would you give to anyone who wants to get involved in activism but doesn't feel like they have a voice?
Greta?
I think that's a very common feeling that many young people have. I definitely felt like that, and I know so many others who also felt like that. Because there's nothing simple you can do. It's not like donate to this and you save the world. Also, many think that it's too late. There are already people doing this and I can't contribute with anything. But the fact remains that if you were to join today, you would still be one of the pioneers, because there are so relatively few doing this compared to how many would be needed. Of course, I'm a bit biased when I say that you can join Fridays for Future, but that's a great step.
So, Fridays for Future as a movement is really kind of gained a lot of momentum. Did you ever think that it would get so big?
No, never. Of course not. You don't really plan those things. If you could just plan, now we're gonna start a worldwide movement, then these movements would be created all the time. I don't know. I guess it was just the right thing to do, the right timing. You can't predict those kinds of things. It just spiraled out of control, and people saw their opportunity to get their voice heard, and local chapters started emerging. It was insane, and to see the ability that young people have to organize when they actually are passionate about something.
Yeah, it's great to see people expressing their voice and using their voice for good. Adriana?
Yeah, just wanted to say that, if you feel like you don't have a voice, absolutely don't. I mean, you live on this planet, you're a citizen of this earth, you have a voice. And if your voice is to say that, I don't know enough about biodiversity loss and climate change to know what to do, that is a valid point to make. And that tells me that maybe I'm not doing my job as well as I could. So that's not on you, that's on us. So, if that's the way you feel, then, come talk to to some of the scientists at the museum and learn a little bit more, and hopefully come up with your own ideas of how you can make a difference. But even if it's just to learn a little bit more about the crisis we're in, that's hugely important.
Yeah, and scientists are very much human. They might seem like these kind of totally distant aliens in their labs, but actually, they're always willing to have a chat, and they like it when you reach out and you're curious about what they study.
And also, just to add on the thing that we often don't think that we have a voice, that we can make a difference, and that is of course a very strategic, beneficial way of like those in power to maintain the status quo. Because if we think that we can't change anything, then we won't even try to change anything. And if people aren't even trying, then they can, even much more than today, continue to get away with their actions. So yeah, and then they will stay in power, and yeah, so
change begins with believing you can make a change.
yeah, I mean, seeing the potential in people power.
Thank you very much.
I think we have another question down there.
Hello, I would like to thank you for all your activism that you've done, firstly. But my question would be about protests and how the media sometimes puts it across that it's even damaging to protest, and what advice you give to young people who want to do that.
I mean, of course, if I understood your question correctly, protests can be there can be protests in many different forms, and of course there are people who think that if the protests are not disruptive, they are doing more harm than good. But of course we can't. Everyone is not privileged enough to risk that kind of things. So, and of course most of us are still just teenagers and children, and then school strikes have been a way to both be disruptive, but also not risk our security for some of us. I know many people who are striking and protesting in parts of the world where it's literally illegal, and they some people risk their freedom, some people risk their citizenship.
Well, I think the question raises an interesting question about kind of the dialogue and the narrative and the discourse, the conversations around protesting and activism, because whenever there are big protests and actions, you see a lot of debate backwards and forwards about whether it's productive or whether it's just a nuisance or anything like that. So how do you feel about how those conversations are had around ecological activism?
I mean, ecological activism, of course, has many forms. Some are more disruptive than others. I do think that as long as it doesn't harm anyone, or as long as it doesn't do more harm than good, it's very needed, because we need to sort of zoom out and look at it in a bit of perspective.
Yeah, I think it's very easy for us to get kind of wrapped up in our individual worlds. And I think I guess that's also something that has been actively done. It's, like Adriana and you have both been saying, the individualization of responsibility, and also the kind of the individualization of our whole lives means that it makes it hard to see the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Adriana, did you have anything to say on that?
Only that I'd say that there are many different ways to protest, and some might seem really small, like buying one product over another from one company versus another, but they're just as important. So putting or convincing your parents or whoever it is, if we're in a privileged position to basically put our money where we want it to be, then that's something that we should do as well. So yeah, not just don't overlook the smaller silent protests as well.
Power comes in many forms. We've got a question up there.
Hi. So let's say we get out of this crisis and we manage to get to a happy world in a way. Who and how do you think we should hold people accountable for it? Because at the end of the day, we can look at these big corporations and they must they must cause so much of the problem compared to just individuals. Surely we should hold them accountable, but how would you do that, and who? You know, do we start putting politicians in prison for not putting in, you know, the right policies, or because technically haven't done anything illegal, how do you suggest we do that?
So, bigger question of justice. Whether it's whether it's climate justice between, you know, developing and less developed nations, or actually holding people and organizations accountable for the damage that has been done to our communal world. What do you think about that?
I mean, obviously we're not there yet in the debate, and I guess it's hard to sort of visualize some future and how that would be done, because I don't know how that future would look like. But I definitely think that they need to be held accountable. The high-emitting nations, corporations, billionaires, because obviously even if their actions have been completely legal, it has been so destructive. And I hope that in the future we will be able to see that. We have at the moment don't have any like laws or restrictions that are long-term protecting us from this like ongoing self-destructive greed that is bringing us to the edge of the cliff. We don't have anything like that that's protecting us, so we need to form that. And I have no idea how we will do that. I don't think anyone knows exactly how. So that's something that we need to come up with on the way, and we need to listen to the people who have been the mostly affected, and and in order to find like mutual ways forward.
I guess one of the challenges with that is, you know, under our current system, the people and organizations that have accumulated a lot of resources from this extractive relationship with nature, that those resources and that money allows them to insulate themselves from the consequences in a lot of ways.
Yeah, exactly. And that gives them even more power and an even louder voice, and in order to delay the necessary changes.
And that the amount of, you know, in more developed countries, you know, for a long time we have been arguably somewhat isolated or insulated from some of the consequences of the ecological and the environmental crisis. But as the crisis deepens, the level of privilege that it takes to avoid the consequences of our long series of mistakes is getting higher. But there's still a layer at the top that is insulated by wealth.
No, I mean, like not only insulated from the consequences, but also from accountability. They shield themselves in, and as long as the level of awareness is so low as it is today, they are able to get away with it. Unfortunately.
Yeah. Adriana, any thoughts?
I think the time is swiftly coming to an end where there will be insulation from those consequences, because not only are now some of the wealthier nations seeing, you know, more extreme climate events that are impacting, you know, their wealth and their people, but we're also seeing a huge increase in climate refugees. I mean, since 2010, I think we had over 20 million people displaced because of climate change, and you know, by 2050, that's going to go up to about 1.2 billion, apparently. So even those areas that are insulated right now, and because, you know, it's easy to forget about the consequences of your actions if they're happening half a world away. It's coming here too. So I think, yeah.
When the consequences arrive at your front door,
exactly.
Accountability is hard to avoid.
Yeah.
We have another question down here.
Hey, thank you. Just talking about the Paris Agreement and what we have to do to meet it, how hopeful are you about COP27, and do you think it's going to deliver what we need?
So for a start, for someone who might not know, what is COP27? And then we'll answer the question.
Yeah, every year the UNFCCC has the Conference of Parties, where high-profile people gather in one place in the world to negotiate and try to find try to like increase their ambitions to the climate crisis. I mean, that's the thought, at least, but it not in practice. In practice, it's more like a greenwash festival where people with a lot of power fly to say that this is what our country is doing, and then many countries still try to block any like further ambition. So as it is now, I don't. There won't be anything. There might be like some small like symbolic victories that they use in order to be able to have something to celebrate, while at the same time in the background they are continuing in the wrong direction. I mean, as it is designed now, it is not supposed to solve the climate crisis as it is, because as I talked about before, we are only trying to look for solutions that are like possible within this current system, and as long as they are so I mean corrupt, basically, they won't be able to find anything.
Adriana?
So we've also got a conference of the parties for biodiversity coming up at the end of this year, and it doesn't get as much coverage as climate, unfortunately. And I still don't really understand why we have two separate COPs, because they are so interlinked that I feel like we should, it should be kind of a planetary COP or something.
Half as many flights.
Yeah, exactly. You joke, but it is true. So yeah, my concern is that the way that the system works now is that we gather for COP and say what our targets are, but there's no real scrutiny of how we're ever going to meet those targets. There's no requirement to actually have a plan, like a true plan in place to meet those targets when these announcements are made. So I'd like to see this be more of a process that happens over time. And I'm really hoping that at the next COP they have much greater visibility and true representation from people from frontline communities, because they did in Glasgow a bit, but we could be much better at that, because it does. I mean, talking about kind of eco-anxiety, frontline communities, even the way we talk about it is that they're at the front line of a war, and at the moment they're kind of fighting that battle all on their own. So I'd like to see more of that. But honestly, I think I'm starting to see more interest from companies, because they're really starting to see that, if there's a big drought, or the biodiversity is lost in their area, their entire supply chains can collapse. So they're starting to see that it makes economic sense to protect the environment.
Yeah, if we have, like, as you say, we need more representation. If we have bigger representation from fossil fuel companies than communities on the front lines, that basically says it all about what we prioritize in these conferences. But of course that doesn't mean that we should just give up. I mean, the COPs are a great opportunity to mobilize people and to bring awareness to the fact that we are speeding in the wrong direction. We don't have any high expectations, but we can still try to do everything in our power to push in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, we'll get some nice targets to breeze past.
Yes.
I'm going to try and remain a little bit optimistic. Khalil.
So we've got a couple more questions up there, I believe.
Do you think there might be an issue with power abuse within governments or authorities, and that this may be a reason why they're getting away with not having really pushed as much with solving the environmental crisis?
I mean, I meet people like very, very often who work within these kinds of institutions, who say that they want to push for more, but they are unable to. Also within media, journalists who want to write about this but are not really allowed because of their rules or their editors. Of course, we cannot blame every single individual who works within these sectors, because there are obviously many who are trying. But yeah, that could definitely be a big reason.
Adriana, you staying out of this one?
Yeah, I'm sure that it is a problem in many places. I couldn't really speak about that, but I also think in general, a lot of governments aren't really set up to deal with these kind of big issues. I mean, if you think about it, often you have people creating policy for urban areas and people creating policy for food and environment and people creating policy for climate and people for business, when in fact all of these things are so intertwined that trying to split up the way we develop policies just makes it inherently difficult as well.
Oh, entrenched power, hard to shift.
Yeah, and also many use the excuse that we don't really have the public support for this. When every opportunity they get to talk about this, they lie and say that we're doing this, we are investing more in renewable energy, we're moving in the right direction. How do they expect to have support for any significant actions if they are lying straight to our faces and try to convey the message that everything is all right, we can fall back asleep?
So I've been given permission by the powers that be for one more question. I remember there was a hand up near the back. We'll go with you. I'm really sorry.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, thank you for granting me one more question. I want to ask that if governments were to act, what do you think that they could do to encourage companies to be more carbon neutral or even negative? And what do you think that this would look like in practice? Would it be taxing companies for not doing sustainable practices or something else?
How can we move the levers of capitalism? Adriana?
I really think it's about making sure that the environment is valued. So that should be a cost that the companies have to account for. And again, conversations that I've been having with some companies suggest that they are already thinking about that. So, we might not need to go down that route necessarily. I think we probably should, but they are already starting to realize that when your product is based on the environment, which the vast majority are, protecting the environment is in your best interest as a company. So I think getting that message across to them is, it's a process, but I think we are getting the message across and they are starting to consider that in their kind of long-term business plans. It's not always just about, sustainability or greenwashing or anything like that. It's actually, for the environment, the economic viability of their business, they have to protect the environment and they are thinking about that.
So Greta, carrot or stick?
I like carrots, but but yeah, as you said, there are of course some companies that are starting to realize that it's more beneficial for them to prioritize the environment. And if we had hundreds of years to solve this crisis, that would be great. But as it is now, we don't really have that time. So I think we need more than that.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think so. Even in our research, we've found that if we wait 10 more years to try and deal with this biodiversity crisis, it's going to cost double the price. We don't have the time or the money or the land really to be able to wait to solve these problems. It's urgent that we fix it now.
So carrots are nice, but urgency requires that it might have to be carrot and stick.
Yeah.
Great. So I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you so much for being here with us. And as we said, it's really important that we continue these conversations as widely as possible in public and in private and do the work that's required to stand up for the planet and everything on it. And thank you so much to Greta Thunberg and Adriana De Palma as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.